Welcome to the Doing Good podcast, formerly known as the Common Sense Steps to Doing Good. I'm Karen Phillip, a passionate advocate for doing good. I believe in the wheel of social impact that we're preached at too much and not enough time is spent acknowledging who we actually are. I've spent my career meeting amazing do gooders, and while their work is celebrated, their humanity is often overlooked. I created this space to peel back the layers, to share our stories, our struggles, our triumphs, and the secrets to doing good better. Welcome to the Doing Good podcast. I'm your host, Karen Phillip, and today with me is Derval Barzey, the founder and host of the Climate Conscious podcast. Welcome, Derval.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for having me.
Great. Can you tell people a bit more about who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm the founder and host of the Climate Conscious podcast, but I'm also a sustainability consultant with a background in environmental risk management, as well as sustainability and environmental, social, and governance management.
That is a mouthful, but we'll be digging into what all those things are and how it's related to doing good. So to start off, I asked all my guests, what is in your doing good toolkit? What are the three values that carry you through life?
Sure. So, for me, it starts with impact. I always want to make a difference positively. So I look at, what is going to be the impact of this action or my contribution or my participation. The second one is community. And that has a two-way flow. We all need support. We all need encouragement. So you look for like-minded persons or shared spaces where there is a common goal where you can contribute and also be poured into. And last but not least, for me, it's boldness. And that's the boldness to pursue a dream or to follow through on a vision. I think, many people have great ideas, but, not many of us, some of us are, and sometimes we are all, stuck at the point of conception. But being bold enough to pursue that vision, that dream, to seek out support, resources. And in the end, it may not look like what you originally envisioned, but at somewhere along the line, you are able to arrive at that intended goal. And for that one in particular, I think about my podcast. Launching a podcast with no media training, an aversion to public speaking, no technical podcasting equipment, but having that vision and being bold and brave enough to pursue it.
That is beautiful. And I do love that you talked about how starting the podcast with no experience and same thing here. And you were one of the persons who I could testify that you do believe in community. You did allow me to ask you questions and you were open to provide your experience with me. So let's talk a little bit about how that podcast started.
Yeah, so the Climate Conscious podcast, it's really amazing to look back on it almost 6 years in. And at the time, back in 2020, I was participating in a mentorship program for women in renewable energy that at the time was hosted by the Clinton Climate Foundation. And we were required to conduct a project, carry out a project or a call to action. So I was thinking about, what can I do? I want to have impact, right?
Yeah.
And I was listening to a lot of podcasts. There weren't many Caribbean-based podcasts. One of the few was Tammy Takes Everything. She's out of Jamaica, Tammy
Yes.
Shin.
Yes.
And I just loved that, I guess, medium of listening and, tuning in to hearing people's perspectives, their stories. And I thought about, what if I married that with my passion for sustainability, my interest in climate change.
Mhm.
And I also recognize that, I was involved in the climate change space, but the average person wasn't really tuned into, the real implications of climate change. But at the same time, so this was in 2020 when I started.
In the
I
middle
think
of the pandemic or
in the
before?
middle of the pandemic,
Okay.
people
Okay.
were recognizing how the environment was quote unquote healing as we
Yeah.
were in lockdown. Um, and I saw where people were starting to make the connections, but there was still a big gap. So I decided that for my call to action, I would launch a podcast. I had no idea that it would span 5+ years, but it originated as a project where that would allow me to bridge the gap between technical information around climate change and
Mhm.
the average citizen who may be inclined to tune into our podcast. I found that it was a different avenue to bring information about climate change, about environmental sustainability to a wider and, in particular, a non technical audience. So, yeah, in the midst of the pandemic, that's when it all started at home with my laptop. I first started off using Skype, which is crazy to think about it now.
Yes.
And I tapped into my network because, as I mentioned, I work in the environmental sustainability
Yeah.
field. So I tapped into my network, and even being a part of that wire network, it gave me a regional network, persons who are already involved in this space. And their jobs may not be specifically labeled as climate, but it's all connected when we talk about sustainability, right? And then another aspect of it too that really encouraged me to pursue this was that I saw, even in international climate conversations where we saw activists emerging, such as Greta Thunberg, the narrative was really, skewed towards what we know as the global north. Climate change perspectives were dominated by the more developed nations, the United States, the Europe, the European Union, and I felt that the Caribbean perspective was not really being heard, not being shared prominently or featured at all. But at the same time, we are on the front lines. The Caribbean is already experiencing, it's already battling with climate change impacts. So I felt there was a need to put forward the Caribbean perspective, to add our voice to the conversation. And I felt that a podcast was the ideal way to do that.
All right. So can you give us a snippet for those of us who still not sure what is this climate change and how it's really affecting our region? Because since we're small, we are accustomed to these hurricanes, we are accustomed to this, and we are a majority of us may not be aware of the ratings for our region as a hurricane hazard prone region. So if you could just give us like a snippet of what exactly does this climate change mean to our region?
Yeah, so the term climate change, in the grand sense, it's a natural phenomenon. The climate changes over time.
Mhm.
But due to human activities, namely the burning of fossil fuels, since the Industrial Revolution, we have become industrialized. We have a lot more vehicles, a lot more even industrial agriculture.
Mhm.
And this has contributed to an increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases,
Yeah.
one
Okay.
of which is carbon dioxide. Methane is also another one, which we get from landfills and also industrial agriculture, farming with livestock. So this has led to something that we know as global warming. And as the planet gets warmer, it intensifies the changes in the environment, the changes in our weather patterns, our long term weather patterns, which we call climate. So, weather is short term, it may be sunny this morning and rainy in the afternoon. But climate looks at long term patterns. So, for example, in our region, we have our rainy season and our dry season. But climate change refers to the changes in those patterns. And with those changes, we see the disruptions that are happening, right? So we're seeing periods of drought, we're seeing periods of intense rainfall leading to flooding, we're seeing the effect on the oceans. The oceans are also warming up as well. And then we're seeing things like coastal erosion, water scarcity, changes in the productivity of our agricultural system. So it really, when we speak about climate change, we speak to those impacts that are a result of the changing in our long-term climate patterns. And as you mentioned, we have historically had hurricanes. We have a hurricane season, right, from June to
Yeah.
November. But with climate change, with global warming, we're seeing that the frequency of those hurricanes is increasing as well as the intensity of it, right? And this ties back to a warming planet and how it fuels these systems either to be disrupted or intensified.
Ah, okay. So I think I understand, but I want to find out a bit more about how you got involved in this and what made this a passion for you. I know you spoke about being part of the Women in Renewable Energy program, but like from a child, were you always interested in the climate in environments and how we lived in harmony with it or not in harmony with it?
So I always had a passion for geography in school. I think back then climate change wasn't really the big buzzword that it has become now, but I
Yeah.
always loved learning about different environments. But being born and raised in the Caribbean, I'm familiar with our tropical environment, but through geography class, which I studied all the way up to Form 6, I learned about different um, environment ecosystems, I should say.
Yeah.
And I always enjoyed being in nature. I loved going to the beach, I guess, as a typical island girl. And then growing up in a fairly rural area, the environment was always around, but as I pursued my studies, I began to learn how our environment was really taking a hit. And I
Mm-hmm.
began to learn about concepts such as sustainable development. And I realized that, this thing that we enjoy, that we take for granted, if we don't change our trajectory, we could really be in some serious trouble. And I guess based on that interest and involvement in the environment from since being a little girl, it was just a natural progression for me to study environmental management for my undergraduate degree at the University of the West Indies. So I went in there very passionate, very excited, um, to learn not just about the environment, but what we can do to safeguard it, right? And I think what was a very defining moment for me was during my undergraduate degree, I got the opportunity to participate in a graduate trainee program at our national oil and gas company. And that was really eye opening because that's where I saw where the techniques, the skills that I was learning in terms of environmental risk management, this is where it needed to be applied, right? Because I also got the view that, okay, this was one of the main economic earners for the country, but it also has a very significant environmental footprint, especially if you're
Yeah.
operating in, let's say, you have marine operations. So, a shared space with fishing communities. You also have to look at how you impact the marine environment, your affluents. So that's why I saw where my skills would or the theory would come off the page and it has to be applied in a real world context.
Mhm.
And I think that is what sparked something in me because when we talk about sustainable development, it's still development. We still
Yeah.
want to improve people's standard of living. We still want to, produce and grow economically. But how can we do that in a way that still allows our environment, our people to thrive? So I am most inspired by sitting in that space, the nexus of economic and social development as well as environmental sustainability, because at the end of the day, we all want to achieve our goals, our dreams, improve our standards of living, provide for our families. But how can we do that in a way that coexists with other priorities?
Yeah, but I'm definitely also hearing how professional community has shaped you. So this is the second professional program that you messaged that you said that really challenged the way that you viewed life and the way that we interact with the environment and that you have power. Is that you would say the same thing that community gives you a sense of power to act on what you think of?
Well, it's definitely linked to when I mentioned, the boldness to pursue a vision.
Uh-huh.
Definitely having community, fuels that because you feel like you're less alone. You feel like you have shoulders to stand on or persons to, engage with, bounce ideas off of. So community has definitely been that thread running through my career and my, professional pursuits. That really community does so much. It opens doors, it provides encouragement, and it really gives you that momentum to keep going.
Yeah. So you could tell us a bit more like how your personal community helped you in your doing good. Were your parents supportive of you doing this? Um, how was it in school, in high school? Were you the tree hugger or would they call you Captain Planet?
So definitely my personal community has been, a really solid foundation. I must say that, my parents and my family have always supported my pursuits, my crazy ideas. um, but specifically when I launched the podcast, they were very supportive. And I have to mention, in particular, my aunt, Marian, who, if it's one person that listens to every episode, it's Auntie Marian,
I
and she can
love
see,
that.
yes. And she's a retired nurse, so she wasn't directly involved in, say, environmental management.
Yeah.
But hearing her speak now about sustainability and climate action and all that she has learned, throughout that journeying with me, it's really rewarding and fulfilling. And I take that as a measure of the impact that the podcast can have to, as I mentioned, a non-technical audience, So I'm really grateful for my support system, my entire family. They definitely encourage me and support me in my pursuits. So that's really important.
Yes, definitely. It's important to have that group that makes you that could hold you when you're crying over your crazy idea and you don't know how to execute it. And then also the group to tell you yes, or maybe no, also. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how, like, so when you're going through a tough time or like trying to execute one of your crazy ideas, as you called it, I don't think any of them are crazy because I have seen the fruits of your labor. What do you rely on? How do you get through those tough times?
Well, I mean, it's life. The tough times will come. For me, it's sometimes it's pausing, it's taking a step back, and then reminding myself of your why, as we see, um, and the vision, coming back to the vision. And um, for me, it's being flexible. I think when we're too rigid, we hold on to a specific trajectory
Mhm.
or a specific blueprint. But I think when we allow ourselves to, be creative or be led, as doors open or as help shows up, that allows us to overcome those challenges, those bumps in the road. So for me, um, when any kind of frustration or roadblock comes, I try to take a pause, maybe, take my mind off of it, pursue something else, and then come back to it with a fresh outlook. As well as maybe getting someone else's, a trusted person's opinion, someone else's view that could maybe help you identify some blind spots that you may have, or they may present an option that you didn't consider before. So again, coming back to community, right? So yeah, I think it's for me, it's just being willing to explore. And I personally have the belief that everything is figure outable. So I hold on to that. I hold on to that. But I think sometimes it's important to kind of step away from the frustration and then come back with a fresh view.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And let's talk about another community that you built, the CW4CJ. You can tell us what it stands for and how that community has been shaking up the way that we narrate climate issues in the Caribbean.
So, CW4CG, Caribbean Women for Climate Justice. So, this originated as a way to commemorate the anniversary of the podcast. So, the podcast itself has evolved from being just a podcast to becoming, I would say, a regional movement. And
Nice. Congratulations.
one of the key themes that emerged from the climate conscious conversations was the issue of climate justice and also how that connected with gender justice. So for the first installation of CW4CG, which is a virtual conference, virtual regional conference, I partnered with the Bradford Collective, which is an NGO based in Guyana that focuses on gender and climate justice. And we produced this event that brought a range of stakeholders together, but with a focus on grassroots to really help persons understand what is climate justice. Because I spent a couple of years helping people understand what is climate change. Now we're taking it up another level, talking about climate justice. And then not only that, but we're showing how it intersects with gender justice in the
Mhm.
Caribbean. But we felt that it was really important to help people to understand because we felt that, we can be channeling a lot of energy and resources toward climate action. But if we leave out that justice lens or that gender lens, those actions will not be effective, right? Because
So you're gonna
climate
need to explain to us those lands.
Sure. So when we talk about justice and we talk about gender, it's really about being inclusive. It's about recognizing that, climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. There are different levels of exposure to climate risk. There's different level of vulnerability. So what might make someone more vulnerable to climate change? If we're all living on the same island, why would there be different pockets of vulnerability? Well, it has to do with existing inequalities, and that could be from the dimension of economics. So we have low income or impoverished communities, their
Yeah.
ability to recover from, let's say, a hurricane is different from someone living in a higher income community, right?
Okay.
That's an
Okay. Yeah.
example of an existing inequality that is made worse by climate change, right?
Mhm.
So when we speak about justice, it's about ensuring when we are addressing climate change, we're not ignoring any of those vulnerabilities. And
Mm.
when we bring in gender to the conversation, it's recognizing that women as a group are also vulnerable, even before we add climate change impacts to that equation, right? So
But we
it's
also
about,
have inequalities within that because it's not only just women are not treated as equals in society, right?
right,
We understand that. But then, as you just pointed out, we have layers that we have the intersectionality. So it could be that a woman with disability is facing
yes,
even more of a challenge.
correct.
Yeah.
So when we talk about justice and we talk about inclusive climate action, that's what we want to get to. We don't just want to. Well, firstly, we can't just look at people as one group. So we have to
Right.
look at the different genders, and then even within those groups, we have to look at, as you mentioned, persons with disabilities. persons with from low income communities, right? Persons who are already on the fringes.
Mm-hmm.
What are their needs? What do they need to be resilient to climate change, to be able to recover or to prepare for or adjust to the impacts of climate change, right? So we found that a lot of our climate change policies or interventions, they don't naturally cater to those different needs, right? It's a kind of broad
Yeah.
brush approach. So through CW4CJ, we brought the conversation to a wider audience about what is climate justice and what does that look like for the Caribbean. And what I'm most proud about in terms of producing CW4CG, which the last episode, sorry, the last edition of it, you were a part of in 2025, is that it also created a platform to showcase what is already being done
Mm-hmm.
on the ground by women who are leading climate action, who are leading resilience, and who are often the first ones to engage in rebuilding communities when disasters hit. So it's really a platform to share knowledge, but also provide visibility for what is already being done around the region by amazing women who are leading initiatives. For example, we have the Caribbean Feminists led by Sophia, who's based in Trinidad. We have Girls Care Jamaica, which is based in Jamaica. We
Mm-hmm.
have um, so many amazing prisons leading initiatives. We have Carolyn. We have Helen's daughter out of St.
St.
Lucia.
Lucia. Yeah.
Yeah, and so many more. And but I'm just happy that creating this space to not only highlight the issues that we may not that are often hidden, because when a disaster, let's say when a hurricane happens, the headlines would be, the infrastructural damage, but we're not often exposed to, okay, so an entire community was affected. We in the Caribbean we have a lot of woman-led households, right? What
Correct.
happens there? you
Yeah.
know, and in an entire community, maybe a male-led household has more resources or opportunity to rebuild more quickly as opposed to a female-led household that may not have that level of access to resources
Right,
to.
so let's unpack that. Let's not just leave that there. I think what you're saying, using my gender lens, you're saying that a male-headed household may have greater access because it has been proven that they get easier access to financing from banks, right? That's what you're.
Well, that's one aspect of it.
Uh-huh.
And just to go a bit deeper, like when we talk about female-led households in the Caribbean region, one aspect of that is that a lot of women are involved in the informal sector, or
Yes.
they may be involved in sectors that are very dependent on the environment. For example, fishing, agriculture, or hospitality. So, or even hairdressing, as an example.
Mhm.
So, you can contrast that with a male-led household that may be in more formal employment. Just as an example of vulnerability, and this is not, again, it's not a broad brush for all women, but it's about recognizing that there are these groups within the grouping of women who are increasingly vulnerable, right? Um, so yeah, so they are really in a precarious position in terms of the length of time that it may take them to recover.
Mhm.
And added to that, the burden of care that is on women in terms of childcare, caring for elderly parents or even neighbors that they will assist. That's we use the opportunity to showcase those layers to vulnerability and why when we're talking about boosting resilience, we have to look at these unseen burdens that women carry.
Have you always been passionate about gender issues?
Honestly, no.
So let's talk about that journey.
Honestly, no. I think for me, I grew up in a community that I would say was very matriarchal.
Mhm.
And I was surrounded by strong women, but I think as I became more and more exposed, um, particularly in my professional journey, where I started to experience the effects of gender inequality, it was very eye opening to see that, although in the Caribbean, I think we like to say that women are very empowered, but it's in spaces and places of power is where we see the big gap, and where there's this unspoken expectation of women to stay in their place or women to be seen and not heard. To give you an example, as I mentioned, I worked in the oil and gas sector.
Yeah.
And so after graduating, I went in and I was working in HSC, Health, Safety and Environment. And, for some persons, the expectation is as a young as a young woman, as a, your place was administrative. So the expectation was that as a young woman, your place was in an administrative role as opposed to a technical role. And I had to overcome that challenge, almost to fight to be recognized or accepted as a professional. And yeah, I started to see, some of the challenges that women continue to face, and that can be related to so many other sectors, where
Yes.
the the playing field is not even. And I think what that showed me also is that even as we pursue gender equity, we really have to take men along because they currently hold many of the positions of power. And it's not about necessarily displacing men, but creating space for men and women to coexist, to share, and to be empowered to make decisions that benefit, all of us. Um, so that's a little insight to my
Your
gender
journey.
justice journey. Um, I think I was a bit naive to the gender, I don't want to call it a struggle, but the gender challenge that still exists. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to contribute to moving it forward, at least in the climate space. And thinking about it now, everything is so interconnected because the mentorship program, Women in Renewable Energy, it was about empowering young women in the renewable energy space, right? Recognizing that energy as a whole is male dominated. But how do we get women to, elevate? Because we see where in universities, the classes are dominated by women, right?
Yes.
Across faculties, right? Not
Yes.
sci, humanities, engineering. But when we get to the corporate space, when we get to the boardroom, where are those women, right? And if the women are not in the room, if the women are not at the decision making tables, that's where we get these policies and programs that do not cater to the many dimensions of being a woman. A woman who's a professional, a woman who's a homemaker, a woman who is a farmer, or a woman who's doing all of those things at any given
Yeah.
point in time.
The disconnect between the policy and the grassroots. This episode is brought to you by Kainos Caribbean, a consultancy dedicated to helping you do good better. From grant writing to project management, Kainos Caribbean provides the common sense steps to turn your passion into a powerful, well run organization. We help you cut through the jargon to find the right path to creating real lasting change. Visit kainoscaribbean.com to see how we could help your organization thrive.
Correct.
But it's
Correct.
also what type of woman as well, right? Because we know that not every woman holds the same desire for gender equity, as you said.
Correct.
And we also know that some of us reinforce the gender biases or the gender stereotypes and believe that the woman's space is at home. And even if they're in the corporate, they still believe that the woman's space is to just support. I You talked about having to fight for your voice when you were working in the corporate. And I remembered I was doing a gender project with an organization trying to work through their gender mainstreaming. And the CEO watched me in my face and was like, no, we must hire women. They are the ones that make the babies and they mind the babies. So they won't walk off the job. So that's why we hire women. And I was just like, so not for their qualifications? Not for this. She's like, no. From the time a woman has a child, she will stay in that job no matter what. The man will walk off. And that talks about the care that's placed on us, the care that's placed on us at home and in the workplace. Because he's expecting that person to turn up and perform for how many hours a thing, as if they don't have a child, but knowing that they're going to stay in the job no matter how bad the conditions get because they have a child.
And
So
that's
it's
interesting because he's aware of that, additional labor that the woman has, but instead of, supporting that or enabling that, he is exploiting that.
yes.
So yeah, so we still have a long way to go, even as we make progress. And I completely agree with you that there are some women who still, endorse the inequality. So it's really about, how do we change those mindsets,
Mhm.
you know?
And how are you doing that through your podcast or your work? I know that you also had a workshop on climate justice for community groups, I think.
Yes, yes. So I ran a campaign with the Crystal Clear Foundation, and we hosted a workshop called Access Granted. So the objective is really how do we get these community groups to gain access to the funding that is available? I mean, we are calling for more funding, but for the opportunities that exist, there are many barriers to grassroots organizations really tapping into those networks. And not to deviate too much, but just to drive home the point that we need the resources to hit the ground, right? Because
Yes.
when disaster strikes, it's our national systems, they're not usually the first one on the ground. It's the people in the communities who show up, right, to help someone whose house may have collapsed, for example. So it's important for community groups to have access to resources. And many times, to access grants, as you would know, because this is your area, how can we support them in going through that process to get to the funding,
Mhm.
so yeah, we got together a group of representatives from community-based or NGO organizations and really, help try to help them to understand, how they can navigate that grant space. And it was really fruitful, also to hear about what they have been doing, the experience that they have so far, and how they intend to move forward. And that group also include representatives from the indigenous community, the Waro, and
Nice.
yeah, and it was also intergenerational as well. It was
Right.
very diverse because we're talking about inclusion, right? So just creating space for more persons to have access to resources. That is another challenge in climate action and climate justice. As our governments fight for more access, even when that funding comes to our countries, how does it trickle down? How does it get through all the bureaucracy to where it matters most, which is underground?
Yeah. Yeah, and I like that you talked about the inclusiveness. So you talked about the indigenous community and also intergenerational, because that's something that did cross my mind earlier. Like that these terms are relatively new. I mean, when I was in primary school, we talked about the ozone layer disappearing and that stuff. But what about the generation before us? When they've been hearing this all the time, but yet they're still living on the earth and nothing's really happened per se, or where they just they don't have access to podcasts. They don't know what a podcast is. How do they get the knowledge? How do you extend the impact that you're having to the older generation, and if you have done it, if they've been receptive?
Yeah, so my intervention has been primarily through digital platforms,
Mhm.
and it generally targets, the demographic from, let's say, the 20s to maybe about 45. But what I have seen that has an impact on other, the more mature groups is when we go into communities, when we host, you know, offline events. For example, we have hosted one or two events in collaboration with ARC Co-Create. They're a space based in Tacarigua in Trinidad. And that's why you see, a range of age groups coming together to engage, to share ideas, to learn, to support each other. But what I would like to say, although the terms are new, you know, the environmental advocacy work has been going on for quite some time,
Mhm.
and we are just building on that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, as well as the gender. I think even more than environmental, the fight for gender justice has been going on for quite some time in our
Yes,
region. And
yes, it
we
has.
have benefited from that, and
Yeah,
I must make mention of one of the stalwarts, Miss Judith Wedderburn, out of Jamaica.
yeah,
I was really privileged to meet her and interview her on a series that I did with Canary, for her to share her insights. And she gave
she's a
such,
queen.
I mean, you just can't get better than that in terms of understanding what is happening on the ground. So these are the people who need platforms, these are the people who need the resources. I mean, the policymakers have their place. They are important too. But I feel like on the ground is where it happens. On the ground is where it happens.
And I know, all right, and I know, I think I've heard you said before that you think that there's a misconception that policy making is only for technocrats, but it's something that all of us could get involved on. Do you want to touch on that a bit?
Absolutely. So policy making, it has to be for us.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it should include us, right?
Yeah.
So it requires, I think, widespread stakeholder participation. And that is what would make a strong or an effective policy. So we need to bridge the gap between the technocrats and the beneficiaries of that policy. And it requires meaningful consultation, meaningful participation, even moving beyond consultation, because we all know that that tends to be a tick the box exercise, right?
Yes,
You
yes.
set up a meeting and you say that the community was consulted. But what I advocate for, with amongst many others, is that you want people to be involved from conception, right? You want to firstly understand what are their needs, what are their challenges, and what are their ideas. Many times, solutions can come from the community. So I believe that policymaking should be community led, and it definitely should be, collaborative, not the technocrats sitting in a room drafting something and imposing it on a community,
Yeah.
but engaging with the community from start to end and allowing the co creation of that policy. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I fully agree with you. And so you saw your phrase value was impact. And throughout this time that we've been talking, I've just been hearing about your amazing impact that you've had so far. And I have not even touched on the fact that your podcast has been recognized as a leading climate change podcast. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So, yeah, UCL, that's a university in the UK. They published a list of leading climate and sustainability podcasts, and I was so amazed and pleasantly surprised that the climate conscious was listed on that list, and it was really a testament of the global reach of the podcast, which I'm grateful for because we focus on the Caribbean, but
Yeah.
the message is universal because there are so many other communities that may be experiencing similar challenges, but not their voices not being heard. And also, we want decision makers in those spaces in the global north as well to recognize that they have to widen their view.
Mhm.
So I'm definitely grateful for when the podcast expands out. Um, and we have a listenership in a number of territories across the globe, and I'm truly grateful for that.
And how do you celebrate that? Because I realize that, like with do-gooders, we seem to struggle with celebrating our wins, and these are all quite big wins that you've spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of celebration, I think that's why I try to acknowledge the anniversary of the podcast. I mean, each
Okay.
year is a milestone. Um, in the podcasting space, there's something called podfade, where podcasts just die off after a couple episodes.
Yeah.
And I understand because it's not easy to keep going. This is something
Mhm.
that I do in addition to a full time job. But I celebrate the milestones, big and small, because I think this work is important, and I'm seeing the impact that it has been having. So that encourages me. That is the fulfilling part of it. When I meet persons and I say, you should listen to my podcast, and they're like, I listen to the climate conscious, you are the climate conscious, and they tell me something that they like about the show or they learned from the show. That is the most rewarding part of it.
So you told me what's rewarding, but you didn't tell me how you celebrate.
How do I celebrate? I celebrate by trying to do more.
Ah! So is there anytime you stop and you be like, okay, I'm gonna buy a cheesecake, I'm gonna go on a trip to be like, I have done this good week and I am deserving of rest and celebration as well?
Yeah, definitely. So with the podcast, one of these decisions I took was to take breaks in between seasons.
Uh-huh.
And that in itself is a risk because, listenership can fall off if you're not producing content all the time. But it's necessary to rest, to reflect, and as you said, to celebrate. How do I celebrate? I do enjoy um, interacting with communities. So maybe going out, having a nice dinner with a friend, and yeah, reflecting on the accomplishments. I think that's how I celebrate what I've been doing. And that allows me to refuel, you know, when you pause and reflect and acknowledge the good that you have done, it really fills back up your tank. And when the people around you really celebrate that as well.
The community. Yeah. When Auntie Marian calls you and tell you good job, we're going out.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to challenge you to try to celebrate a bit more. I know it's something that I do as well. Like as you said, when you finish something, you're like, okay, so what else needs to be done? But I'm just gonna tell you to remember your humanity. Remember that you deserve to be celebrated as well. And you started off with your values, your impact, your boldness, and your community. And I want to tell you, if you don't know, that you have a massive impact, and you should be proud of the legacy that you've been creating through your community and also your boldness. 6 years, that's really long in podcast life. And I just want to tell you what an amazing job that you've been doing. And I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. You provided great insights on why climate issues are important to us in the Caribbean, how you as a person was developed through professional communities, and also the importance of not stopping. So seeing the obstacles and finding a resilient way to address them and ensure that the policymakers also hear us so that we could continue to be doing good.
Thank you, Karen. It was really a pleasure to speak with you and to reflect on my journey. Thank you so much for your kind words of encouragement. And yeah, I look forward to being back on the Doing Good podcast.
Yay! Thank you for tuning into the Doing Good podcast. If you found value in this conversation, please subscribe. You can find every episode of the Doing Good podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your audio. For video content and all show notes, including links to Derval Barzey's week, visit our YouTube channel at Kainos Caribbean. Be sure to follow us on social media at IG and LinkedIn at Kainos Caribbean to stay up to date on season 2 episodes and join the conversation. Until next time, keep doing good better. This episode is brought to you by Kainos Caribbean, a consultancy dedicated to helping you do good better. From grant writing to project management, Kainos Caribbean provides the common sense steps to turn your passion into a powerful, well-run organization. We help you cut through the jargon to find the right path to creating real lasting change. Visit kainoscaribbean.com to see how we could help your organization thrive.